The chamber was buzzing, its air thick with tension long before the cameras even started rolling. Everyone knew today's hearing was going to erupt. The subject on the floor wasn't just policy, it was power. At the center of the storm sat Jasmine Crockett, a congresswoman who had built her reputation on fiery outbursts and sharp takedowns, the kind that usually left her opponents scrambling. But across the table sat someone she hadn't managed to rattle before, Karoline Leavitt. Karoline didn't flinch as Crockett leaned forward, her voice already rising before the gavel even struck. "You're done." Crockett barked across the microphones, her finger jabbing toward Karoline like a weapon. Gasps scattered through the room. It was the kind of attack that usually sent her rivals shrinking back, their voices lost in the roar. The cameras zoomed in instantly, anchors in newsrooms across America waiting for the clip they could replay on endless loops. But Karoline didn't move, she didn't even blink. Instead, she adjusted her microphone with deliberate calm, her eyes fixed straight on Crockett's as though she were studying every ounce of rage, every ounce of desperation. To the casual viewer, it might have looked like silence, but to anyone in the room, it was a storm building behind her restraint. The press knew what was coming, so did the politicians lining the chamber. The irony was almost poetic. Crockett believed she was delivering the knockout punch, that the soundbite of her shouting down Karoline would dominate primetime. But what no one understood in that moment was that Karoline had been waiting for this exact attack, the attempt to dismiss her, erase her, belittle her in front of millions. What Crockett thought was her moment of dominance was about to become the biggest mistake of her career. With the crowd still buzzing, Karoline leaned ever so slightly toward her mic. The tension was electric, the seconds stretching as if time itself had slowed, waiting for her response. She didn't need to shout, she didn't need to flail her arms or pound the desk. She knew the weight of one perfectly chosen line could cut sharper than 1,000 angry words. And in that instant, everyone realized, Jasmine Crockett had set the stage, but Karoline Leavitt was about to own it. The room fell into a hushed suspense as Crockett's words still echoed against the walls. "You're done." It wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration, an attempt to erase Karoline's credibility in one swift blow. Reporters' fingers danced over their keyboards, already drafting headlines about Crockett's dominance. But they were premature, because Karoline hadn't even started. Karoline leaned forward, her hands resting lightly on the desk, her posture the exact opposite of Crockett's explosive theatrics. The stillness made her presence even more commanding, like the calm before lightning splits the sky. She let the silence drag on just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable, long enough for the cameras to catch every twitch of Crockett's expression, every impatient shuffle of papers from her allies. Then, with a steady voice that carried sharper than any shout, she delivered it. "Congresswoman, the only thing that's done is your argument." It wasn't a scream, it wasn't a rant, it was surgical. The line hit with the weight of finality, the kind that immediately shifted the energy in the room. A low murmur rippled across the chamber as Karoline's words sliced through the tension. Crockett blinked, momentarily stunned, her mouth half open as though searching for a comeback that wouldn't come. The clip, already streaming live, exploded across social media. Viewers saw the contrast instantly, one woman raging and shouting, the other delivering a single line that dismantled it all. Comment sections lit up, Karoline just buried her with one sentence. Crockett tried to shout her down, but this was a masterclass in composure. By the time Karoline paused to let the room absorb her words, hashtags with her name were already trending. But Karoline wasn't finished. She straightened her papers with deliberate calm, as though she had all the time in the world, then continued, "The American people are tired of politicians who think volume is a substitute for truth. I don't need to yell to defend my case. Facts are louder than insults, and the facts are on my side." It was a rebuke not just of Crockett, but of an entire style of politics, the performative outrage, the viral shouting matches that replaced real debate. The cameras zoomed closer on Karoline, who spoke not just to the room, but to the millions watching from home. Crockett's finger, once pointed in accusation, now hung awkwardly in the air before she finally lowered it, her power play collapsing in front of everyone's eyes. In that instant, the balance of the hearing had shifted. Crockett's outburst was no longer the headline. Karoline's restraint, her precision, her ability to win with one devastating line, that was the story that would travel across the nation before the night was over. Karoline didn't waste a second after regaining control of the room. She leaned into the microphone, her tone even sharper now, not with anger, but with precision. "You know what the American people see when you shout like that?" she asked, her gaze locking on Crockett. "They see a politician more interested in theatrics than in answers." The words cut clean, landing harder than Crockett's scream, because they exposed the deeper truth. Volume might dominate for a moment, but it collapses under scrutiny. The cameras captured Karoline's face, steady, fearless, almost surgical. She didn't look like someone cornered. She looked like someone who had just flipped the board and forced her opponent to play on her terms. "We were sent here to solve problems, not to scream at each other like children," Karoline continued. "If you want to act like this is a reality show, go ahead. But I was elected to talk about reality, the border crisis, the families being hurt, and the chaos being ignored." Her words shifted the atmosphere. Staffers who had been smirking at Crockett's outburst now looked uneasy. The audience of reporters sensed something more significant was unfolding. Karoline wasn't just defending herself, she was turning the entire exchange into a referendum on leadership and integrity. Crockett tried to interject, "Don't lecture me," but Karoline lifted her hand slightly, not in arrogance, but in command. The motion was enough to silence her opponent without a word. The audience gasped. And then Karoline pivoted, widening her focus. She looked directly into the cameras, past the committee room, speaking straight to Americans at home. "This is the choice in front of us, leaders who yell and insult when challenged, or leaders who bring the truth to the table, no matter how uncomfortable it is. I refuse to sit here and let noise drown out the facts." It was no longer just a comeback. It was a speech, a turning point that instantly reframed the hearing. Social media clips of Karoline's calm dominance flooded platforms. TikTok captions read, "Crockett, you're done. Karoline, nope, you are." On Twitter, conservative voices hailed her as fearless, while even moderates admitted the contrast was stark, one woman shouting, the other dismantling the moment with a controlled fury disguised as composure. In that moment, Karoline redefined the room. She wasn't the target anymore, she was the one holding the gavel in spirit, if not in fact. Crockett's attack had given her the platform to remind the nation why she had become such a lightning rod, not because she shouted the loudest, but because she knew how to cut through the noise with a line that stuck. And now, she was just getting started. Karoline leaned forward now, no longer addressing Crockett as an equal sparring partner, but as someone who had already forfeited the debate. "What's really done," she said, her voice low but carrying across the entire room, "is the patience of the American people. They are done with the chaos at the border, done with the inflation that's crushing their families, and done with politicians who believe screaming is a substitute for solutions." The silence in the room was unnerving. Even the shuffle of papers stopped. Crockett, usually quick with a retort, blinked in disbelief at how Karoline had twisted her line into a weapon against her. She had said, "You're done," with the force of a knockout blow, but now it was clear the words had backfired. Karoline took advantage of the quiet, her delivery steady, like a prosecutor making her closing argument. "Every time you yell at me, every time you shout down a colleague, you reveal the truth. You don't have the facts. You don't have the arguments. All you have is volume." She turned, gesturing toward the cameras. "And the people watching at home know it. They're not fooled." The press corps erupted in flashes, each camera trying to capture her defiant pose, one hand on the desk, the other gesturing toward the public as if she were rallying them in real time. Online, the clip was already being cut, memed, and shared. TikTok captions read, "Crockett, you're done. Karoline, no, America is done with you." Crockett finally tried to fire back. "You don't get to lecture me on," but her words fell flat. They were swallowed by the fact that Karoline had already framed the entire moment. No matter what Crockett said now, it sounded defensive, even petty. The audience wasn't waiting for her, they were leaning in toward Karoline. Karoline delivered her final strike for the round, raising her voice just slightly, not a scream, but a crescendo. If you think you can silence me with insults, you don't understand me at all. I'm not here for myself. I'm here for the people you ignore when you grandstand. And as long as I have this microphone, I will not stop speaking for them. The words hit like thunder. This wasn't just a clapback, it was a declaration. The room shook with the force of it, not physically, but politically. Everyone watching knew they had just witnessed the turning of the tide. Crockett's attempt to humiliate Karoline had not only failed, it had elevated her into a symbol of composure under fire. And as Crockett sat back, her earlier bravado drained, the nation was left with the image of a young woman who had taken one of the most aggressive attacks in Congress and turned it into her own defining moment. Karoline didn't waste the momentum. She pressed forward, her voice cutting through the tension with the sharpness of someone who had been underestimated one too many times. Since we're talking about who's done, she said, turning directly toward Crockett, let's talk about policies that have been nothing but a disaster for ordinary Americans. Let's talk about the border you refuse to acknowledge is collapsing, the fentanyl that's pouring in, and the families in my district who are burying their children because of it. The room snapped back to life, whispers turning into full-throated murmurs. Crockett, who had prepared for a personal fight, wasn't ready for Karoline to pivot into policy. Karoline wasn't just defending herself anymore, she was putting Crockett's record on trial. Karoline held up a printed report, her nails tapping against the highlighted lines. According to DHS, more than 2 million illegal crossings last year alone. That's not my opinion. That's the government's own data. And you still stand here screaming at me like numbers don't matter. She slapped the paper against the desk, the sound echoing. Well, they matter to the parents who lost their teenage daughter to fentanyl-laced pills in New Hampshire. They matter to the ranchers in Texas whose property is trampled night after night. They matter to the mothers who can't walk their kids to school without worrying about cartel activity creeping into their neighborhoods. The press captured every word. The narrative was shifting. What had begun as a fiery exchange of insults was turning into a masterclass in redirection. Karoline had flipped the script. The moment wasn't about Crockett's attempt to silence her anymore, it was about Crockett's refusal to answer for the consequences of her own policies. Crockett tried to interject. That's not fair, she began, but Karoline overrode her with precision. What's not fair is your refusal to even acknowledge these tragedies. What's not fair is standing in front of cameras to play politics while Americans are literally dying because of your indifference. The audience was no longer on the edge of their seats, they were leaning toward Karoline, nodding, murmuring in agreement. Even those who hadn't come in as her supporters couldn't deny the weight of her argument. Her one line, "America is done with you," was no longer just a clapback. It was being built out into a case, brick by brick, fact by fact. Karoline glanced at the cameras again, aware that every clip, every soundbite, would be dissected online. This isn't about me, Representative Crockett, she concluded, her voice steady but searing. This is about the people you forgot the moment you traded your seat for a microphone. You want to shout at me? Go ahead, but the country is shouting louder, and they're shouting at you. The blow landed harder than anything Crockett had said all day. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the silence of a nation realizing they had just watched the entire power dynamic shift, live, unfiltered, and irreversible. The room was still reeling from Karoline's last strike when she leaned forward, her tone shifting from fierce rebuttal to razor-sharp analysis. Representative Crockett, she said evenly, what you just did is exactly what Washington has become. Shout, accuse, insult, anything to distract from the fact that your policies are hollow. You want to look tough on camera, but the truth is you're hiding behind theater because you can't defend the reality outside these walls. Her words landed like a hammer. Crockett stiffened, her glare unbroken, but her silence gave Karoline all the space she needed. The crowd wasn't murmuring now, they were holding their breath. Karoline gestured toward the audience of reporters, activists, and staffers. The American people are sick of this act. They're sick of politicians who think shouting louder equals leadership. They're sick of the name-calling, the performative outrage, the constant media soundbites while families can't afford groceries, while crime spikes, while schools fail. That's your legacy, performance, not progress. The cameras zoomed closer. Clips of Crockett shouting, "You're done," were already circulating on Twitter, but Karoline's dismantling was destined to go even further. Her calm, cutting delivery was creating the kind of viral moment politicians only dream about. "You know why you tried to corner me today?" Karoline pressed, her finger tapping the table for emphasis. "Because you thought I'd shrink back, that I'd play the role you scripted for me, the young conservative who's supposed to be intimidated by your bluster. But here's the problem, I don't play roles. I don't take scripts. And I don't back down." The audience broke into applause, a reaction unheard of in what was supposed to be a hostile forum. Even the moderators, usually quick to intervene, allowed the clash to unfold unfiltered. Crockett finally tried to interject, raising her voice again, "You think you're the savior." But Karoline was already there, cutting her off with surgical precision. "No," she said firmly, "I think the American people are the savior. I think the Constitution is the savior. And I think your career is built on pretending otherwise." The silence that followed was almost electric. Karoline had just taken Crockett's attempted ambush and reframed it as the very proof of her point, Washington's addiction to theatrics. And in that moment, it was no longer Crockett's stage, it was Karoline's. The hearing chamber was no longer just another political stage, it had turned into an arena where reputations were hanging by a thread. Karoline leaned forward, her voice cutting through the chaos with precision, while Crockett, red-faced and gripping the microphone like it was her last line of defense, tried to wrestle back control. "You think yelling, 'You're done,' ends this?" Karoline asked, each word crisp and deliberate, forcing the cameras to zoom tighter on her expression. "Congresswoman, the only thing that's done here is your credibility." Gasps rippled across the room, and suddenly every spectator, every aide, every journalist realized Karoline wasn't just fighting back, she was rewriting the terms of the exchange in real time. Crockett's eyes narrowed as she shot back, "You're nothing more than a mouthpiece for a movement that thrives on chaos." Her words came fast, but shaky, betraying that her confidence was fraying. She was hoping the insult would stick, hoping it would paint Karoline as a reckless partisan in front of millions. But Karoline didn't even blink. She let the words land, then smirked slightly, as if Crockett had just handed her a setup. The silence after Crockett's outburst felt heavier than the shouting. Everyone waited for Karoline's reply, knowing she would land it. Karoline didn't raise her voice, instead, she lowered it, forcing the chamber to quiet down. "Chaos," she repeated slowly, her tone almost surgical. "Chaos is what your side created at the border, in our schools, and in the streets of American cities. And when people like me call it out, you scream louder, hoping no one notices. Well, people are noticing, and your volume won't save you tonight." The audience erupted, not in laughter or in mockery, but in a raw, electric cheer that cut through the solemnity of the chamber. Even those who tried to remain stoic were caught shifting in their seats, some even nodding as Karoline's words echoed like a verdict. For a moment, Crockett froze, her microphone still in hand but her arguments evaporating before she could shape them. She had underestimated Karoline, expecting a young conservative spokeswoman to falter under pressure. Instead, she was witnessing someone who had mastered the rhythm of confrontation, who thrived in the very storm Crockett tried to drown her with. The energy shifted entirely, the momentum belonged to Karoline now, and everyone could feel it. Crockett had shouted, "You're done," as if she could bury Karoline in the noise, but the line had backfired spectacularly, because now the cameras were showing a woman who stood taller after every attack. By the time Karoline leaned back in her chair, the smirk still on her face, the chamber wasn't Crockett's battlefield anymore, it was hers. By now, the hearing chamber was less a forum of policy and more a crucible of willpower, with Karoline standing unflinching at its center. Crockett, still holding her mic, tried desperately to regain momentum. Her voice cracked as she launched into a tirade about dangerous rhetoric and young extremists hijacking the national conversation. She was reaching, piling buzzwords like bricks in a collapsing wall, hoping to bury Karoline under the weight of accusation. But the problem was clear: every brick slid off uselessly, never landing where Crockett wanted. The audience wasn't buying it anymore. Karoline tilted her head slightly, almost amused, as Crockett went on. Then, when the room grew restless, Karoline cut in, not loudly, but firmly enough to silence every shuffle of paper and whisper in the air. "Congresswoman," she began, "it's fascinating that you think truth is dangerous. It's fascinating that a woman elected to represent the people trembles at the idea of accountability." Her voice sharpened like a blade. "The only danger here is pretending the American people can't see through you. And let me tell you, they see everything now." The room froze. Crockett's face stiffened. Her practiced outrage had found no purchase. The cameras snapped closer, catching every twitch of discomfort, every attempt she made to hide the sudden panic in her eyes. Because deep down, Crockett knew the truth: she had lost the rhythm. Karoline had seized it, bent it, and now was wielding it like a weapon. Reporters at the back began typing furiously, headlines already forming in their minds. What was supposed to be a routine sparring session, a congresswoman humbling a young conservative, had flipped entirely. The story wasn't Crockett exposing Karoline. It was Karoline exposing Crockett. Karoline leaned forward, her eyes locked on Crockett. "You shouted, 'You're done,' like you could erase me from this chamber," she said slowly, every syllable landing with the weight of finality. "But tonight, America just saw who's really done, and it isn't me." The audience exploded again, some clapping, some gasping, the tension breaking into raw reaction. Even members who had sat stone-faced couldn't hide their unease at how thoroughly the tables had turned. Crockett sat back, visibly shaken, no comeback left in her arsenal. She had drawn her sharpest weapon early, but Karoline had snapped it in half and thrown it back at her. Karoline didn't gloat, though. That was the most unnerving part for her opponent. There was no smugness, no desperation to score a cheap victory. There was just certainty, an unflinching steadiness that told everyone watching, she hadn't come here to survive the attack. She had come here to win the whole war. By the time Karoline's words landed, the hearing room felt like it was holding its breath. Crockett sat in her chair, her jaw tight, her hands gripping the desk as if she could squeeze control back into her grasp. But the power had shifted too far, it wasn't hers anymore. The cameras, the reporters, even the audience knew it. The focus was locked on Karoline, and she knew exactly what to do with it. She straightened, her voice calm but carrying with absolute clarity. "This isn't just about me and you," she said, gesturing toward Crockett, though her gaze swept the entire room. "It's about every young American who's been told to shut up, sit down, and take orders from the political elites. It's about every family who's been silenced while politicians like you pretend to fight for them but really just fight for power." A murmur rippled through the chamber, the weight of her words impossible to ignore. Even those who disagreed with her politics couldn't dismiss the force of the moment. Karoline wasn't defending herself anymore, she was channeling something larger. Her fight with Crockett had become a symbol, and the realization made the room electric. Crockett tried to break in with a dismissive laugh, but it sounded hollow, nervous. "Spare us the performance," she muttered, hoping to cut the tension. But Karoline turned her head sharply, pinning her with a stare that froze Crockett mid-smirk. "This isn't a performance," Karoline shot back. "It's reality. And the reality is, Congresswoman, you thought you could intimidate me, shout me down, and end my voice with 3 little words: 'You're done.' But what you didn't understand is that millions of Americans watching tonight are tired of those words being thrown at them too. You weren't just shouting at me. You were shouting at them. And I promise you this, they will answer louder than you ever imagined." The room erupted, some in applause, others stunned silent, as if they had just witnessed a historical pivot in real time. Crockett leaned back, suddenly very small against the backdrop of the chamber, her earlier bravado evaporating into awkward silence. The microphone in front of her, once her weapon, now seemed like dead weight. Karoline didn't let the silence linger. She lifted her chin, her voice firm. "You can try to declare me finished. You can shout it, you can threaten it, you can even believe it. But I'm still standing here. Stronger. Louder. Unshaken. And every young person watching tonight just learned they don't have to bow to you either." Every word echoed with defiance, and the energy in the chamber shifted completely. Karoline wasn't just countering Crockett anymore, she was declaring a movement. Reporters scrambled to capture it, sensing they weren't just covering a hearing, they were documenting a turning point. And Crockett? She sat in silence, her earlier fire extinguished. The attack she thought would humiliate Karoline had instead backfired so completely that she became the symbol of arrogance crumbling under the weight of truth. The final moments of the exchange felt less like a congressional hearing and more like the climax of a trial where the verdict had already been delivered. The air was heavy, charged, and everyone in the room knew it. Jasmine Crockett had lost control, and Karoline Leavitt had seized the stage with a force no one could have predicted. Crockett, still visibly rattled, tried one last time to regain ground. She leaned forward, her voice quivering with a forced authority. "You think this little speech of yours makes you untouchable? You're still nothing more than a mouthpiece for extremists." She spat the words out, hoping venom could mask her weakness. But Karoline didn't flinch. She stepped closer to the microphone, her posture commanding, her eyes unshakably locked on Crockett. "No," she said firmly, "I'm a voice for people you've ignored. For families crushed under your policies. For citizens tired of your theatrics. And for every young American who refuses to be told they're finished before they even begin." The declaration was like thunder. Reporters' pens scratched furiously, cameras zoomed in, desperate not to miss a single word. Karoline continued, her voice growing steadier, louder, more resolute with each sentence. "You tried to silence me with arrogance. You tried to diminish me with insults. You even tried to end me with 3 words, 'You're done.' But here's the truth, Congresswoman, I'm just getting started. And the more you try to shut me down, the stronger I become. Because this isn't about me, it's about every single American who's tired of being stepped on by politicians who've forgotten who they serve." The audience broke into scattered applause, the kind that starts cautiously but swells into something undeniable. Even those who didn't support her politics found themselves struck by the sheer conviction radiating from her. Crockett sat frozen, her attempt at a retort dying in her throat. The fight was over, and everyone could see who had won. Karoline leaned in, lowering her voice just enough so the room had to lean closer to hear. "So go ahead, Congresswoman. Keep shouting, keep dismissing, keep declaring people finished. But remember this, the people you silence today are the voices that will end your career tomorrow." The chamber erupted. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and the words instantly began ricocheting across social media. Within minutes, "You're done" was trending, but not as Crockett had intended. Instead, it became a rallying cry flipped on its head. Karoline had turned the insult into her weapon, her shield, and her anthem. As the hearing adjourned, Crockett quickly gathered her papers, avoiding eye contact, her once dominant presence diminished to silence. Karoline, on the other hand, stood tall, her expression calm but victorious, knowing the world had just witnessed a defining moment. She didn't just survive Crockett's attack, she transformed it into a turning point that would echo far beyond the walls of that chamber. And as she walked out, reporters following her every step, one truth was crystal clear: Jasmine Crockett had tried to end her with 3 words, but Karoline Leavitt had responded with a lifetime's worth of defiance. In the end, it wasn't just a clash between 2 women, it was a battle over voice, truth, and the right to be heard. Jasmine Crockett thought she could bury Karoline Leavitt under insults, dismissals, and the thunder of "You're done." But Karoline proved that no voice can be silenced when it speaks with conviction. What began as an attempt to shut her down became a moment that electrified millions. She turned 3 words meant to end her into an anthem that will follow her, and haunt her opponent, for years to come. This was more than politics. It was a reminder to every American watching, no matter who tries to corner you, no matter who tells you that you're finished, your fight, your faith, and your truth can turn the tables in a heartbeat. Jasmine said, "You're done." Karoline answered, "I'm just getting started." And in that instant, the nation saw the future.